about the promise. We talked about love as a decision. We made a distinction between feelings and thoughts, and we had to decide, and continually decide, not once but every day. We thought about what we're making a decision about, between man and woman and God, that triangle. And when do we make that decision that can't be broken? When we make the promise. The biblical word for promise is a covenant. So it's a covenant between a man, a woman, and God. Now you find a covenant in the Bible in the 12th chapter of Genesis, the covenant that God made with Abraham. He made a covenant with him. God promised him. He promised him that his descendants would be like the sands of the seashore. That is, the stars in the sky. That you can't count the stars in the sky, you can't count the sand, the grains of sand on the seashore, so would the descendants of Abraham be. It didn't look like he was going to keep that promise, did it? Because here he was, an old man, about 100 years old, and he's never a kid yet. According to the Bible, he's about 100 years old when he has that child, Isaac. And only one child. And then God asked him to give me your son. And if he gives up his only son, how's the promise going to be kept? But he does surrender to God. So he keeps his covenant. And there's that beautiful scene in Genesis where Abraham and Isaac together walk up the hill. And it says Isaac carried the wood of the sacrifice on his back. Abraham was ready to give up everything for God, keeping his part of the covenant, to serve God as his only God. That's why Abraham's called our father in faith. And because of his faithfulness, because of his keeping of his promise, God promised him. And there was a covenant, a binding covenant, a promise that could never be broken. The word promise is very important in my life. I very seldom ever use it. I'm scared of it. Because when I grew up, my mother would never say that word unless she meant it. I remember one time asking her before Christmas for a bicycle, my first two-wheeler. I was only a child. I wanted this two-wheel bicycle instead of a three-wheeler. And I said, can I have a bicycle for Christmas? She said, maybe. And I said, no, don't say maybe, promise me. She said, no, son, I won't promise you. Because if I promise you, you know you'll get it. And then there'll be no surprise. She said, has Mama ever broken a promise to you? And I thought about it. I was only a kid. I said, no. She said, no, I never will. She said, whenever I promise somebody something, that's my word. And that's very sacred. And so never use that word when you don't mean it. Say maybe, say I'll try. But never, ever, ever say I promise. Because that's a solemn, solemn bond. That's you. That's your integrity. You promise. And then that only worked, for reward. As a matter of fact, I did get the bicycle for Christmas, even though she didn't promise, even though she said I'll try, or maybe. I remember another occasion when I was in a restaurant as a child, misbehaving myself. And she said, when you get home, you're going to get thrashed. And that's a promise. And I knew I wouldn't get out of it. Sometimes she just said, I'll thrash you when you get home. And I always kept my fingers crossed and said, well, she didn't say I promise you. And if she didn't promise it, I could always get round her. I could sweet talk her. I could go up and give her a big hug and tell her I loved her. Or offer to say the rosary with her. Get her in a good mood, and then I didn't get the thrashing. But it wouldn't matter what I did. I could buy her candy, I could hug her, I could tell her I loved her, I could sweet talk her, and it wouldn't make any difference. She says, come here, I've got to smack you because I promised you. And Mama's got to keep her promise. Because if ever I break my promise, you won't trust me anymore. So whenever I say I promise, I mean it. That stuck with me? That's why for a long time I wouldn't become a priest. Even after I converted from the Playboy days, even after I started serving the Lord and going to confession and going to daily Mass and living a Catholic life, for 4 or 5 more years I still didn't go into priesthood because I knew that would involve a promise of celibacy. And that kind of scared me. See, I wasn't sure I could keep it. In fact, right up to the time I took my vows. And diocesan priests don't take vows. We make just a promise. And vows are more sacred than a promise. I remember the night before I took the subdiaconate, when a priest promises to remain celibate. See, that word promise came up again. And that scared me. I didn't sleep all night. If you read the book Playboy the Priest, there's a chapter about it, where I spent the whole night looking out of a window and saw a man go by with his son, realizing that thousands of people would call me father and nobody would call me daddy. That kind of scared me. I thought, hey, I've got to promise God that I'll never have a child. I've got to promise God that I will never love as a man loves. And I'll promise it. I can't say, God, I'll try. Can't do that when you're a priest. Or maybe, God, when you walk down that aisle and lay flat on that floor, and the bishop puts those hands on your head, that's a promise. And I remember what my mother said. Never make a promise you can't keep. That was scary. In fact, one of my classmates went out of the church during the ordination service. The cardinal, who was performing the ordination, warned all of us. He said, nobody's asking you to make this promise. Nobody's twisting your arm. Nobody's got a gun at your head. But you are standing in the presence of God. You are saying to God, voluntarily, of your own free will, I, with my own free will, come forward now, God, and promise you my life in a life of celibacy. He said, if you don't think you can make it, if you have any doubt in your mind right now, don't make this promise. One of my classmates at that moment got up and ran out. You know, they call your name out as you come forward before the bishop in Latin in those days. And as your name is called, you're supposed to say, ad sum. That means present. But when they came to this classmate's name, our dean of our year had to say fugit, which means he fled. And he fled because he couldn't make that promise, because he wasn't sure of that promise. And that's something for you young couples to think about as you pretend now, or I hope not to pretend, but intend, to go forward for your marriage vows. What you're making is more than a promise, it's a vow. And a vow is a solemn promise made to God. See, a promise, I can make a promise to a person, that's just my word to another person. But a vow is my word to God. Just like Abraham, just like Moses. Go through the Old Testament and see all the covenants they made. Look through the book of Exodus and see God's covenant with Moses. God's covenant with the Israelites. God has never broken a promise. And those who made it in the Bible kept their covenant. Except the Jews broke it, didn't they? And the Old Testament's about that, where God kept renewing his covenant. Even though they kept breaking their promise to him, he kept renewing his promise to them. So marriage is supposed to be like God in the Old Testament. Like God with Abraham. Like God with Moses. A covenant made by those two people to God. They come before God to make a solemn promise that they will live with each other, for each other, until death do they part. Not just in good times, but in bad. Not just in well times, but in sickness. Not just in riches, but in poverty. They promise, the priest says, do you take this woman here present to be your lawful wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, in sickness and health, until death do you part? And the bridegroom says, I do. And then the bride is asked, do you take this man here present to be your lawful husband from this day forward, to have and to hold, for richer, for poorer, sickness and health, for better, for worse, until death do you part? And he says, I do. And the priest then, in the name of God, lays hands on them. There's the covenant. A solemn bond between this man, this woman, and God. God is going to keep his promise to give them a sacrament. God is going to keep his promise to give them the necessary graces. God is going to keep his promise to fulfill all that they need in that marriage. So God won't break his promise to that married couple. But how many times have married couples broken their promises to him? So the Bible has something to say about that. I'm going to read it from my own book, you better believe it. To those now married, however, I give this command. Though it is not mine, it is the Lord's. A wife must not separate from her husband. And if she does separate, she must either remain single or become reconciled to him again. Similarly, a husband must not divorce his wife. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11. In Ephesians 5, verses 31 and 30 to 33, for this reason a man shall leave his mother and father, and shall cling to his wife, and the two shall be made one. This is a great foreshadowing. I mean that it refers to Christ as the church. In any case, each one should love his wife as he loves himself. The wife, for her part, showing respect for her husband. You see, they're no longer one, but they're no longer two, but one. They're no longer two. Think of that. They're one. And what makes them one is that bond that God is there, making them one. It's like the Trinity itself. In our last lesson, we talked about the triangle. Well, see, that triangle is like God, the Trinity. There are three persons in one. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They're not three gods, they are one. And so marriage is in the image of the Trinity. They're not three persons, they're one. God in her, and God in him, and God in both of them. They are one. Perhaps it's appropriate, in the background now we hear church bells. We also hear church bells in weddings. I hope that those church bells that you hear at your wedding, that solemnize your promises, won't be empty promises, but real promises. You're making a covenant, remember. Jesus himself makes a covenant in the New Testament. His promise. This is the covenant in my blood. What was that covenant in his blood? He said, this is my body. This is my blood. That was Jesus' covenant. The blood of the Lamb of the New Testament. The body and blood of the Lamb that feeds us. And as we eat the body and blood of that Lamb becomes our body and blood. We see a prototype of that in the Old Testament. With Moses, that's how the covenant was originally signed. It wasn't by accident that God told Moses to pick a lamb. A male lamb without blemish. A male lamb without blemish. Jesus is that male lamb without blemish. It wasn't by accident that God told Moses to kill that lamb and shed its blood to the last drop. And then to wash the people's sins away with the blood of the lamb. And then to eat the body of the lamb in a holy meal. And then take a cup of wine and drink and make the promise of the covenant. Every Jew is familiar with that covenant. That's why they're called the promised people. They're the people of promise. They're the people of the covenant. The Jews are God's chosen ones. He made a covenant when he signed that with the blood of the Lamb. Moses took the blood of the Lamb and touched the people with the blood of the Lamb. And touched the homes of the people with the blood of the Lamb, with the mark of the Lamb. And the angel of death passed over their homes. God kept a promise not to destroy them, all those who were marked with the blood of the Lamb. For he was their God, and they were his people. But he destroyed those who were not marked with the blood of promise, with the blood of the covenant, with the blood of the Lamb. And for hundreds of years, as they waited for the Messiah, the future promise, because this was not a covenant in itself, this wasn't an end in an end of itself. The promise was a future promise, that if they lived according to his promise, according to his covenant, that he would send a greater promise, the Messiah. The Jewish religion is waiting for the fulfillment of that promise. And so in the fullness of time, Jesus was born. God kept his promise. And God fulfilled his covenant. And when Jesus grew up to manhood, and became a preacher, and preached the message of the promise of the new covenant, he was introduced by John the Baptist, the last of the prophets of the Old Testament. And he pointed across to John the Baptist as the people were watching. Perhaps they were on the way up to Jerusalem. It was Passover time. A time when they renewed their promise. See, every year they had an anniversary. That's what the Passover is. So every year, on the anniversary, come up to the temple and bring another lamb, a male lamb without blemish, and have it slaughtered in the temple, and be washed in the blood of the lamb, and then receive the holy meal, eat the body of the lamb, and renew the cup of covenant. That was what they were on their way up to Jerusalem. Just picture the scene. We're out here in the open with the birds singing, the sun shining and the clouds up there above. And here we were in a scene like this. Ours as a people, perhaps. And there's this preacher, just like I'm preaching to you in the open now. And they're all listening intently to John the Baptist. He's preaching about the coming of the kingdom, about the fulfillment of this promise, this covenant. And maybe there were a few lambs going by, because on the way up, people had lambs, and they were carrying them under their arms. And live lambs make a noise. Maybe as they had this lamb under their arm, they're taken up to the temple. The lambs were going, bah, bah, bah. And people hearing the lambs were distracted. And so John the Baptist gets their attention back and says, hey, look, there's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, not the sins of the Jews. And he pointed to Jesus. Everybody was drawn to Jesus. He was in the crowd. He was one of those watching. He wasn't the preacher. He was the listener. And everybody looked over at Jesus. There's the Lamb of God. How prophetic for a prophet. What happens to the lamb? The lamb is slaughtered at Passover. His blood is shed to the last drop. And his body is eaten in a holy meal. Jesus was the Lamb of God. And every day he renews his promise. Every day it's called Mass. A priest takes the bread, as Jesus did, in his hands, and repeats the words of Jesus. This is my body. And then he takes a cup filled with wine. He says, this is a cup of my blood, of the new and everlasting covenant, of the new and everlasting promise. Take ye and drink. When a Jew drank from a cup, that's how he saw his promise. That's how he signed his covenant. That's how he signed his contract. At a Jewish wedding, the bride and groom drink from a glass of wine. And they break it, so no one else can drink from it. That's how they sign their covenant in a Jewish wedding. That's how they make their promise. And Jesus does it as a Jew. He takes the cup of his blood, and says, drink from this, all of you. And each time you do this, you renew the covenant. The most impressive thing to me ever was not a wedding, it was a wedding anniversary. I was in Denver, Colorado, giving a mission. And a couple came for their golden wedding anniversary to the 11 o'clock Mass. And there they were, coming back 50 years later, not 5 years later, not 10 years later, not 20 years later, 50 years later, to renew their wedding vows, to renew their covenant. And God had kept his promise. Part of the wedding services, blessing, is that may your children be numerous. May you see your children, your children's children. Well, here they were. God had kept his promise. Sitting in the church there were 4 rows of pews. All their children and their children's children and their children's children. 4 generations. The children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and even great-great-grandchildren. They were old now, wrinkled. After the gospel and the homily, I called them forward. She was all dressed up in a nice dress with a big corsage. And he had a new suit on and a tie, a nice shirt. And I watched their children crying and their grandchildren. As I again turned to the old lady and the old man, all their faces were wrinkled now. He was no longer young and handsome and virile. He could hardly walk. In fact, he walked with a cane. He had a paunch. His face was wrinkled, and his head was bald. What hair he did have was grey or white. And she was a little old lady, her face all wrinkled up like a prune. No longer pretty. Flabby. All the shape gone. Neither one of them had any sexual attraction for each other, I'm sure now. At least it wouldn't seem so to me. And yet there was a lot of love in their eyes. They turned towards each other. And I said, John, do you take Mary here present again for your lawful wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for rich or for poor, in sickness and health, for better for worse, until death do you part? When I said the words this time, there must have had a lot of meaning in them. 50 years before, when he heard those words for the first time, he didn't know what worse was. He didn't know what sickness was. He didn't know what poverty was when he said yes, when he said, I do. But as I repeated them this time, I'm sure he remembered many times when she was sick, when he probably had to get food for her and bring it to her in bed, or even visit her in hospital. When I repeated the words this time, I'm sure he remembered many times when they had no money to pay the bills, when they were poor, maybe been out of work, maybe even on welfare. There must have been many days when they worried where they'd get the money from to pay the bills. And I'm sure there were worse times. Times when they fought. Times when they were angry. Times when they never talked. Times perhaps when she went back to mother. Times when he wasn't at home, or she. I'm sure when she repeated the words, she thought of the times too, that he'd been drunk perhaps. I have no idea what times they were. For all I know, he could have gone through a drinking spell and come home drunk. There might have even been times when he was unfaithful, and she'd have forgiven him. There were certainly worse times. Maybe there were times when he was sick, and she had to nurse him. Certainly there were times, maybe perhaps when she had to work and he didn't. And she had to be the breadwinner. And I'm sure all these thoughts came flooding to their minds as they looked back over 50 years. On their wedding day, they didn't know what they were promising. But on their golden anniversary, they did. And so now she knew what she was promising. And there were tears in her eyes when she said, I do. And there were tears in his eyes. And there were tears in the eyes of their family. And there were tears in my eyes. Because he was a couple that had made a promise and kept it. I remember the day I was ordained in Rome, everybody was congratulating me. And one Monsignor came up to me and he said, I'm not going to congratulate you. You haven't done anything yet. He said, all you've done today is say, here I am, Lord. He said, when you've been a priest for 25 years, and you've done what you said you were going to do today, when you've kept the promise, when you've lived the covenant, when you've lived priesthood, in good times and bad, when you've ministered to the people for 25 years, when you've been another Jesus for 25 years, and you've done it, I'll come and congratulate you on your Silver Jubilee. But I don't congratulate you on your ordination day. You know, we can apply that to weddings. Everybody rushes around, congratulations. What have they done? All they've done is said, I'm going to do it. Why do we congratulate people for saying they're going to do it? The time to congratulate them is when they've done it. And today that's become much, much more difficult. Years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, was very common. Most people did do it, didn't they? They not only said, I'm going to do it, they not only made the promise, but they kept the promise. And today, in the 1980s, the most common thing today is not those who keep the promise, but those who break it. Because divorce is more common. It used to be that Catholics didn't get divorced. They said, we made a promise, we've got to keep it. But now, Catholics as well as anyone else, we have as many broken promises as other religions. There are as many divorced Catholics as divorced Jews, or divorced Buddhists, or divorced Hindus, or divorced agnostics. We have our share. And that's why before you marry, that's why during this preparation period, that's why during these lessons, we're trying to let you know what you're letting yourself in for. Don't just get all dressed up, spend a lot of money, making promises you don't intend to keep. And don't think it's going to be all easy, because it isn't. The promises you're going to make are forever. And the promises you're going to make are not just for when good times, not for richer, not just when you're well, not if you set out to be sober. Those promises are for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, until death do you part. A promise that you have to decide to keep every day of your life. Remember, promises are serious, and a vow is the most serious of all promises. Promises you've made to each other and to God. God bless you.